The bar smelled of sweat, stale beer, and the kind of excitement that comes when people know they've cheated death one too many times. The squad had just returned from a mission that should have left them scattered in pieces, but instead they sat laughing, drinking, and savoring the warmth of survival. Jackson Ward, their weathered leader, leaned back in his chair, chuckling at Ethan Cross's latest absurd impression of a panicked field commander. Ethan's exaggerated hand-waving had half the bar howling. "You're lucky that idiot didn't hear you," Mara snorted, nursing her glass. "He'd have tossed you off the cliff himself." Ethan grinned. "Please, if he knew half the crap we pulled off behind his back, he'd have." His words trailed off as his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his smile faltered, but only for a second. "Be right back," he muttered, heading for the exit. "Grab some air for me too," Jackson called after him, raising his glass. That was the last time they saw Ethan Cross. At first, no one worried. It was typical Ethan behavior to wander off for a while, maybe flirt with someone or stumble into a corner shop for one of those disgusting energy drinks he loved. But when 20 minutes turned to 40, and 40 into an hour, Jackson started feeling that icy pit in his stomach. He called Ethan's phone, straight to voicemail. They combed the nearby streets, checked the local vendors, even convinced the bartender to show them security footage. There it was, Ethan, stepping into the alley just outside the bar. Moments later, a black van screeched to a stop, 2 figures jumped out, and Ethan was gone. The phone turned up 2 blocks away, bloody and cracked. Ethan's ID and wallet were still inside, but his dog tags, the ones he wore religiously, were missing. That hit Jackson the hardest. The team burned through every contact they had. Mara worked her connections with local fixers. Their medic, Cole, paid off an informant who claimed Ethan had been taken as part of some underworld kidnapping scheme. But nobody knew why. Ethan was just a tech guy, skilled, sure, but not someone to start a war over. The breakthrough came 3 days later when a street informant, eyes darting like a nervous rabbit, whispered something that made Jackson's blood run cold. "The red auction," the man muttered. "He's marked as property now." The red auction was the sort of thing whispered about in places where nightmares were currency. People with specialized skills or rare modifications, coders, hackers, even soldiers, were sold to powerful buyers for their talents or organs. Jackson's squad had danced along the fringes of crime before, but this was something else entirely. Desperation set in. They knew they couldn't hit the red auction alone, no one did. It was said to be untouchable, protected by syndicates powerful enough to bury governments. So, with no other option, Jackson reached out to Juno Reed. Juno was unpredictable, sarcastic to the point of being insufferable, and wore her disdain for authority like a badge. But she knew the red auction better than anyone. When Jackson found her, she was halfway through a slice of pizza in some dingy backroom lit only by screens. "Found your boy?" she asked without looking up. "We know where he is," Jackson growled. "We just don't know how to get him out." Juno smirked, wiping her fingers on her jeans. "You're lucky I'm bored." The squad wasn't thrilled about Juno's involvement. She was notorious for playing both sides, working with whoever paid her best. But Jackson knew they didn't have a choice. Juno got to work fast, tapping away with her fingers flying across the keys. "Ethan's scheduled to be auctioned off in 48 hours, she muttered. "Looks like he's been tagged as Lot 17. She glanced over her shoulder. "That's a premium listing. They aren't just selling him, they're marketing him." Jackson clenched his fists. "Why?" "Military cybernetics," Juno explained. "Your tech guy's got some serious hardware in his head. Word is someone found out he's got high-level encryption tech embedded in his neural core. Whoever buys him is getting more than a person, they're buying a walking treasure chest of classified information." Jackson swallowed hard. That was why they'd taken Ethan, and it also meant whoever bought him wouldn't hesitate to kill him once they extracted what they needed. The team worked through the night planning their infiltration. Mara had her maps spread across the floor, marking key entry points. Cole checked their gear repeatedly, ensuring every piece of equipment was combat ready. Juno barely left her computer, muttering darkly about encrypted feeds and network backdoors. Tension thickened the air as the team ran scenario after scenario. Every plan ended the same way, a bloodbath with no guarantee of saving Ethan. By dawn, they had a strategy. They would pose as bidders, infiltrate the auction, and extract Ethan before his sale could go through. Mara would plant explosives to create chaos if things went sideways. Juno hacked into the Red Auction's internal systems, rerouting key surveillance feeds to buy them more time. As they geared up, Jackson pulled Juno aside. "If this goes bad..." "It won't." Juno cut him off, but her voice lacked her usual smugness. "Look, I know I don't exactly play well with others, but I owe Ethan. You know that." She paused. "We'll get him back." The night of the auction came fast. The team, dressed in sharp suits and grim faces, walked through the heavily guarded entrance. The room was dimly lit with crimson chandeliers and velvet drapes, luxurious, yet unsettling. The crowd was worse. Wealthy elites and criminal kingpins whispered among themselves, laughing too easily in a room that stank of blood money. On stage, a man in a sleek suit introduced the lots, each human displayed like property. Jackson felt his stomach churn. Then the auctioneer called, "Lot 17. Ethan appeared, shirt ripped and face bruised, arms chained behind his back. His usual cocky grin was gone, replaced with a grim, empty stare. Jackson's blood boiled. The auctioneer's voice rang out, calling for bids. 500,000. A voice snapped. 700. Barked another. Jackson's mind raced. They needed a distraction. Mara glanced his way, her hands slipping inside her jacket, ready to hit the detonator. Before Jackson could signal her, a new voice cut through the room. $2 million. Silence. Heads turned as Victor Cade, a towering figure with a face like stone, rose from his seat. His reputation was enough to silence the room. No one outbid Victor Cade. Jackson clenched his teeth. He knew Victor wasn't here to buy talent. He was here to tear Ethan's mind apart and sell whatever secrets lay inside. "We can't outbid that," Mara muttered. "We won't," Jackson said, eyes narrowing. "We're going to steal him." The countdown clock for the auction ticked down. 30 minutes until the sale closed. "Time's ticking," Juno whispered. "Whatever we're gonna do, we better do it fast." The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Jackson shifted uneasily in his stiff suit, feeling like a wolf in sheep's clothing surrounded by predators. The Red Auction's guests were powerful, dangerous people, tycoons, arms dealers, and shadowy figures whose very presence suggested bloodshed. Victor Cade sat at the far end of the room, a quiet smirk on his face as if he'd already won. Ethan's bruised face haunted Jackson's mind. The squad had to act fast. Juno sat beside him, whispering updates into her earpiece. "I'm into their security feeds," she muttered. "I can kill the cameras for about 7 minutes, maybe 8 if I get creative." "Creative?" Mara muttered from behind Jackson. "I don't like your creative. Last time, it involved setting a gas station on fire." "Hey," Juno smirked. "That fire saved your ungrateful backside." Jackson tuned them out, minds spinning through their plan. Mara had already planted explosives along key exits, enough to trigger panic without leveling the place. The hard part was getting to Ethan before Cade's men moved him. Time was slipping through their fingers like sand. Moments later, the auctioneer's voice thundered across the room. "Lot 17, sold to Victor Cade for $2 million. Jackson's stomach turned as applause rippled through the crowd. Cade rose from his seat, expression cold and smug. 2 of his men flanked him, heavily armed and ready to move. Ethan, still chained, was pulled roughly off stage. Jackson felt his muscles coil. "Juno, cut the cameras," Jackson ordered. "Cutting now," she replied, fingers flying across her tablet. The lights flickered briefly, just enough to cause murmurs across the room. Cade's guards didn't seem worried. They escorted Ethan toward a side exit leading to a private transport zone. That was their window. Jackson and Mara moved fast. Blending through the crowd, they reached a side door just before it sealed. Jackson grabbed the nearest guard, twisting his arm behind his back and slamming him face first into the wall. The man crumpled without a sound. Mara took down the second guard with brutal efficiency, a sharp elbow to the throat dropping him instantly. Moving to the loading bay, Jackson growled into his earpiece. "Cole, you in position?" "Standing by." Cole's voice crackled back. "Truck's ready." The corridor reeked of oil and sweat. Jackson spotted Ethan ahead, wrists still chained, being pushed toward a black armored SUV. Cade's men had their rifles at the ready. Jackson pulled his sidearm, suppressor screwed on tight. "3 guards," Juno's voice whispered in his ear. "Plus 1 driver." "On it," Mara said, low and steady. The first shot dropped the driver before he even reached the car door. Mara moved like a shadow, striking the closest guard in the throat with a blade. The man gurgled once before collapsing. The third guard spun, raising his weapon, but Ethan moved faster. Using his chain arms like a club, he swung them upward, smashing the rifle from the man's grip. Jackson fired once, and the guard dropped in a heap. Ethan staggered, pale and exhausted, but alive. "Took you long enough," he rasped. Jackson grinned. "We stopped for coffee." Mara moved to unlock Ethan's chains, but before her fingers could work the clasp, a bullet streaked past her ear, embedding itself in the SUV's door. The squad dove for cover as more guards spilled into the loading bay. "Juno!" Jackson barked. "Where's our distraction?" "Working on it," Juno snapped. A second later, the explosives detonated. The ceiling above the auction hall shook, showers of dust raining down. Shouts filled the air as wealthy bidders fled in every direction. In the chaos, Jackson's team pressed forward, firing back at Cade's men. A bullet grazed Jackson's arm, burning hot, but he ignored it. His eyes were locked on Ethan, still chained and barely on his feet. "Cole! Bring the truck in!" Jackson shouted. The roar of the engine filled the air as Cole slammed the armored truck through the side gate, scattering debris and throwing Cade's remaining men off balance. Jackson grabbed Ethan and dragged him toward the vehicle. Then Victor Cade appeared. The crime lord stood calmly in the chaos, revolver in hand, his icy stare fixed on Jackson. "You're playing a dangerous game," Cade warned, voice like gravel. "You think I don't know who you are? You're the mercenaries who took down the Aragon cartel. I know how you work." "Yeah?" Jackson shot back. "Then you know we don't back down." Cade smiled thinly, and his revolver shifted, aiming directly at Ethan. Jackson didn't think. He moved on instinct, lunging forward as the shot rang out. The bullet missed Ethan, but tore across Jackson's side, a fiery burst of pain ripping through him. Gritting his teeth, he grabbed Ethan's arm and shoved him toward the truck. Mara covered them with suppressive fire, driving Cade's men back just long enough for everyone to pile in. Cole floored the gas pedal, and the vehicle shot forward, tires screaming against the pavement. "Drive faster," Jackson groaned, clutching his bleeding side. "You think I'm not?" Cole barked, weaving through narrow streets as sirens blared in the distance. The chaos from the explosions had sent local authorities swarming toward the district. Jackson knew they didn't have long before the city was locked down. "Where's Cade?" Mara demanded. Juno's voice crackled through the comms. "He's not dead, but I've got a surprise for him." Moments later, a second explosion lit the sky behind them, a chain reaction triggered by Juno's tampering with Cade's security system. The resulting blaze swallowed half the loading bay, ensuring Cade's plans were in ashes. Hours later, the team regrouped in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Jackson slumped in a chair, exhausted but relieved. Ethan sat beside him, face pale but determined. "Never doing that again," Ethan muttered. "Yeah?" Jackson winced, pressing a bloody bandage to his side. "Next time, maybe don't get yourself sold to a psychopath." Ethan chuckled weakly, then grew serious. "They weren't just selling me for my cybernetics," he said. "Cade knew what's stored in my neural core, classified codes, security keys for high-level military networks. His voice faltered. If he gets his hands on that data. He won't, Jackson said firmly. You're safe now. But Ethan shook his head. No, I'm not. They'll keep coming. Jackson exchanged a grim look with Mara. They'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. The air inside the warehouse felt heavy, like a storm was brewing just outside. Jackson sat quietly, pressing a cold beer can against his bandaged side. The pain was dull now, but it throbbed just enough to remind him how close they had come to losing everything. Across the room, Ethan sat on a worn-out crate, gaze distant and face pale. He had barely spoken since their escape, but Jackson knew his mind was spinning in overdrive. They'll come for me, Ethan muttered at last. Cade won't just let this go. Mara, pacing near the window, scoffed. He's dead. Juno's fireworks saw to that. Juno, who had been lounging with her boots propped on a table, shook her head. Nope, she said between bites of a protein bar. Cade's alive. Burned to hell, sure, but that bastard's too stubborn to die. Jackson's grip tightened on his beer can. Which means we need a plan. Ethan sat up, his voice urgent. You don't get it. They're not just after me for revenge. Cade didn't bid $2 million just for my cybernetics. He knew what's in my neurocore. The encrypted data I carry isn't just random military codes, it's blueprints. Strategic layouts, defense protocols, and override systems for half a dozen high-level security networks. If someone gets that data, they could bypass everything from bank vaults to missile silos. Jackson swore under his breath. The room went quiet as the weight of Ethan's words sank in. If those codes got out, the damage would be catastrophic. Mara finally broke the silence. So what's the play? She asked, her voice hard. We need to wipe the data, Ethan said. Erase it from my neurocore completely. Hold on, Jackson said, eyes narrowing. I thought that data was locked, encrypted so deep it couldn't be extracted. Ethan nodded. It is, but Cade's not an idiot. He's got specialists who can crack it eventually. The only way to make sure it's gone is to destroy it at the source. Destroy it? Juno arched an eyebrow. You're talking about frying your own brain? Ethan's face was grim. If that's what it takes. Jackson wasn't about to let it come to that. He stood, wincing as his ribs ached. We're not turning you into a vegetable, he said firmly. There's another way. Juno sighed. Well, there's one option, she muttered. I know a guy, brilliant coder, paranoid as hell. If anyone can lock down that data permanently without scrambling Ethan's brain, it's him. Ethan's eyes lit with hope, but Jackson felt a familiar knot of tension form in his chest. What's the catch? He asked. He's not exactly friendly, Juno admitted. Paranoid types rarely are. The guy turned out to be a tech recluse named Darius Holt. His hideout was buried deep in an abandoned subway station, a web of flickering monitors, tangled wires, and enough junk to fill a landfill. The man himself looked like he hadn't seen sunlight in years, stringy hair, heavy bags under his eyes, and a wiry frame swallowed by an oversized hoodie. You've really stepped in it this time, Darius muttered, barely looking up from his screen. You're lucky I like Juno. Yeah, you're welcome, Juno shot back. Can you do it or not? Darius leaned in toward Ethan, eyeing him like a scientist studying a specimen. The encryption in your head isn't normal, he said. We're talking high-end military-grade code. If I try to crack it, it'll trigger failsafes that'll fry your neural pathways faster than you can blink. Ethan's face paled. Then what do we do? Darius tapped a keyboard furiously. I can build a security shell around the data, an artificial construct that locks it so deep no one will ever access it. It'll be like locking a vault inside another vault, and then dropping both in the ocean. That's great, Mara said impatiently. But how long's that gonna take? Darius grimaced. Hours. And I'll need peace and quiet. Peace and quiet? Jackson muttered. That's not gonna happen. As if on cue, a distant explosion rocked the ground above them. Dust trickled from the ceiling, and the low hum of power flickered dangerously in the dimly lit room. Juno's hand shot to her earpiece. "We've got company," she growled. "Of course we do," Mara muttered. Darius's fingers danced over his keyboard. "I need 20 minutes, he said without looking up. "And if I stop now, you can forget about sealing that data." "We'll buy you the time," Jackson promised. The team hurried to barricade the subway entrance. Cole dragged a metal crate across the tunnel, blocking part of the path, while Mara checked her sidearm with an unsettling grin. Jackson took position near the entry, shotgun resting against his shoulder. The echo of boots pounding against concrete grew louder. "Here they come," Jackson muttered. The first wave of Cade's men arrived fast, pouring into the tunnel with ruthless precision. Muzzle flashes lit the air as bullets sparked against the walls. Jackson fired back, blasting one attacker off his feet. Mara dropped another with a clean shot between the eyes. Juno ducked beside Jackson, reloading her weapon. "This guy better work fast," she muttered. Inside the control room, Ethan stood beside Darius, watching the lines of code scroll across the screen. Sweat beaded on Darius's forehead as his fingers moved at a frantic pace. "Almost there," Darius muttered. "Just hold." Another explosion rocked the tunnel, shattering one of the overhead lights. Sparks rained down as more of Cade's men poured in. Jackson felt a sharp sting as a bullet grazed his shoulder, but he barely noticed. He could see Victor Cade now, calm and steady as he stepped through the smoke, revolver in hand. "You should have stayed out of this," Cade growled. "I don't like auctions," Jackson shot back. Cade fired first, but Jackson rolled behind cover. The next moment, Mara's planted explosives went off, filling the tunnel with dust and debris. The blast tore through several of Cade's men, but Cade himself staggered forward, coughing and furious. Inside the control room, alarms blared as Darius pounded on his keyboard. "Almost done!" he shouted. "Just hold them back. You don't have much time," Ethan warned. Cade stepped into view, gun raised again. Jackson knew there was no easy way out. He locked eyes with Cade, finger tightening on the trigger. Then a sudden burst of static filled the room as Darius slammed his keyboard one final time. "Done!" Darius shouted. "Data's sealed. Nobody's getting in." Jackson seized his moment. He fired once, and Victor Cade staggered back, clutching his shoulder. His face twisted in rage, but he knew it was over. His men were dead, his prize lost. "We'll finish this," Cade spat before disappearing into the smoke. Moments later, the squad piled into Cole's truck, battered and exhausted. Ethan slumped back in his seat, eyes closing in relief. The threat had been locked away, safe, sealed, and secure. "Hell of a job," Jackson muttered. Ethan chuckled weakly. "Next time, let's just take a vacation." The truck rumbled down the narrow back streets, its engine growling like a beast on its last legs. Jackson sat in the front seat, pressing a blood-soaked rag to his side. His ribs ached, his muscles screamed, but none of that mattered right now. All he cared about was Ethan, alive, breathing, and sitting in the back seat. The data was locked away now, buried so deep no one would ever touch it again. But Jackson knew better than to think it was over. Cade didn't leave loose ends. Ethan leaned against the window, head resting heavily on the glass. His face was pale, and the bruises that marked his skin had deepened to ugly shades of purple. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the subway station, but Jackson knew that wasn't just from exhaustion. There was a weight in his eyes, a look that said he knew this wasn't finished. Mara rode shotgun, her sidearm resting loosely in her lap. She hadn't said much either, but every so often her gaze would flick to the rearview mirror, checking the road behind them. They were all thinking the same thing: Cade wasn't done. He couldn't be. Someone like Victor Cade didn't walk away from failure. He came back harder. Jackson's earpiece crackled, and Juno's voice cut through the static. "We've got a problem," she said, her tone unusually serious. "Cade's regrouped. He's calling in reinforcements. I intercepted their comms. They've got roadblocks set up. We're boxed in. Jackson's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. How many? Too many, Juno said. We need another exit. Jackson glanced at Mara. Ideas? She sighed, rolling her shoulders. Yeah, but you're not gonna like it. Jackson knew what she meant before she even said it. The old river bridge, a rusting death trap barely holding itself together. It had been condemned for years, one bad gust of wind away from falling into the churning waters below. If the bridge held, they'd slip through the barricades and disappear into the neighboring city. If it didn't, well, there wouldn't be enough of them left to scrape off the rocks. We don't have a choice, Jackson muttered. Mara didn't argue. She just gave a short nod, pulled her pistol free, and checked the magazine. If we're doing this, she muttered, we better hit it fast. The road twisted and turned, each corner feeling sharper than the last. Jackson's pulse pounded in his ears. Every headlight that appeared in the distance made his chest tighten, his mind racing with the possibility that Cade's men were closing in. The truck's engine growled louder as Cole pushed it to its limits, speeding through narrow alleys and back roads. Then the bridge appeared, a skeletal outline of rusted steel barely visible against the night sky. Jackson's radio buzzed again. They're on you, Juno warned. 3 SUVs closing fast. They're too close, Mara growled. We're not gonna make it. Hold on, Jackson said through gritted teeth. The first SUV burst into view, headlights flaring like angry eyes. Jackson heard the sharp crack of gunfire as bullets chewed into the truck's tailgate. Mara returned fire, her pistol barking loudly as sparks danced along the pursuing vehicle's hood. Left tire! Jackson shouted. Take out the left tire! Mara fired again, and this time her shot hit true. The SUV swerved hard, clipping the edge of the road before spinning out in a burst of smoke and shattered metal. The second vehicle surged forward to replace it, and Jackson could see a gunman leaning out the passenger window, rifle raised. Before the shooter could fire, the bridge loomed ahead. The rusted metal structure stretched out like a skeleton's ribcage, barely holding itself together. Jackson clenched the wheel tighter and pressed the gas pedal to the floor. Get down! He barked. The truck roared onto the bridge, tires skidding on loose gravel. The structure groaned under their weight, steel beams shuddering and cables straining. The pursuing SUV hit the bridge seconds later, speeding after them with reckless determination. Come on! Jackson growled under his breath. Just a little farther. The bridge shifted beneath them, the metal whining in protest. Loose bolts popped free like gunshots, clanging off the side of the truck. Then a deafening crack split the air. Jackson's stomach lurched as one of the bridge's support beams snapped, sending a portion of the structure crumbling into the river below. We're not gonna make it! Ethan shouted from the back. Yes, we are! Jackson snarled. The truck hit a patch of unstable metal, the tires spinning uselessly for a second before regaining traction. The bridge buckled behind them, twisting and groaning as the pursuing SUV skidded to a halt just before the gap. Jackson could barely make out Victor Cade's furious face in the distance as the last remaining section of the bridge gave way, plunging the SUV and its passengers into the river below. The truck skidded to a stop just past the wreckage. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air smelled of smoke and rust, and the distant echo of collapsing metal faded into silence. Jackson exhaled shakily, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. You're insane, Mara muttered, but there was no anger in her voice, just relief. Ethan leaned forward, rubbing his eyes like he was trying to convince himself he wasn't dreaming. Did we actually make it? Yeah, Jackson said quietly. We made it. The team regrouped in a small safe house miles from the city. It was a rundown building with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture, but for now, it was home. They had survived, and that was enough. Juno arrived a few hours later, looking tired but satisfied. Cade's out, she said with a grin. Word on the street is that he's got half the syndicates after him now. Losing that data put a big target on his back. He's not coming for you anytime soon. Ethan slumped back in his chair, finally allowing himself to breathe. It's over. Not yet, Jackson said. We lay low for a while. No more risks, no more fights. I'll drink to that, Mara muttered, tossing her boots on the table. They shared a quiet moment, no longer soldiers, no longer mercenaries, just people who had been to hell and back. Jackson closed his eyes, letting exhaustion finally take him. Hours later, Ethan stood outside, watching the sunrise paint the sky in streaks of orange and gold. Jackson joined him, standing silently at his side. You still worried? Jackson asked. Always, Ethan admitted. But at least now, I don't feel alone. You never were, Jackson said. They stood in silence for a while longer, letting the morning air wash over them. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. After all they'd been through, nothing could break them now. Next time, Ethan muttered with a faint smile. I'm picking the mission. Jackson chuckled quietly. Next time, he agreed. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when Jackson woke with a jolt, heart pounding and mind racing. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The room was dark, the walls cracked and peeling, the air thick with the stale scent of dust and old wood. It took a second before he remembered the safe house. The rundown building they'd claimed as a temporary shelter after escaping Victor Cade's men. The mission was over. Ethan was safe. Yet Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He rose quietly from the creaky old mattress, wincing as his injured ribs flared with pain. He paused by the window, peering out into the empty street below. The morning air felt oddly still, the kind of silence that made his instincts prickle. The weight of the past few days had worn him down, but his gut told him the fight wasn't over yet. Ethan was still asleep on the worn-out couch in the main room, an empty water bottle clutched loosely in his hand. His face was finally peaceful, free from the strain and fear that had haunted him since they pulled him out of the red auction. Jackson hated to wake him but knew they couldn't afford to stay put for long. He shook Ethan's shoulder gently. Hey, Jackson murmured. Time to move. Ethan groaned, rubbing his eyes. Already? His voice was rough, hoarse from fatigue. I thought we were in the clear. We should be, Jackson said. But something doesn't feel right. Mara was already up, crouched near the doorway with her pistol balanced on her knee. She didn't even look at Jackson when she spoke. I felt it too. Someone's been watching the place. Did you see anyone? Jackson asked. Mara shook her head. No, but I heard a car pass by 3 times last night. Slow, like they were looking for something. Jackson clenched his jaw. They had bought themselves some time by escaping Cade's men on the bridge, but if someone had picked up their trail, that time was running out. We pack light, Jackson said. Grab what you can carry. We're gone in 10. The team moved quickly, gathering supplies and weapons with practiced precision. Jackson kept watch at the window, scanning the street. Nothing moved, but the tension in his gut refused to ease. Something was out there. He could feel it. Moments later, they were back on the road. Cole drove in tense silence, eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror. The roads were quiet, but too quiet. No morning traffic, no pedestrians. It felt wrong. We're being herded, Juno said from the back seat. Her voice was flat, grim. They're pushing us somewhere. Jackson swore under his breath. He knew she was right. The road seemed to narrow the farther they went, turning sharp corners that forced them into tighter spaces. There was no easy way to turn back, no alternate route that didn't take them deeper into the unfamiliar streets. Then they saw it, the black SUV parked across the intersection ahead. Cade's men were out of the vehicle before Jackson could react, their rifles already raised. Drive! Jackson shouted. Cole slammed the gas, tires screaming against the pavement as the truck lurched forward. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets slamming into the rear panels. The back window shattered, sending glass raining down on Juno and Ethan. Jackson twisted in his seat, firing out the window as one of the gunmen moved to block their path. His shot hit true, and the man collapsed in the street. The truck screeched around a corner, narrowly missing a parked car. Another SUV appeared ahead, skidding sideways to block their escape. "Hold on!" Cole shouted. The truck slammed through the narrow gap between two vehicles, metal shrieking as side mirrors snapped off and scraped paint streaked down both sides. The force threw Jackson hard against the door, pain flaring in his ribs, but he barely noticed. All that mattered was keeping Ethan safe. The chase dragged on, weaving through narrow alleys and empty streets. The pursuing SUVs kept coming, relentless and efficient. Jackson knew they wouldn't shake them for long. "We need an out!" Jackson barked. Juno leaned over the dashboard, eyes scanning the map on her tablet. "There's an old train yard up ahead," she said. "If we lose them in there, we might have a shot." The truck skidded around the final corner and barreled into the train yard. Rows of rusting cargo containers stretched in every direction, stacked like a metallic labyrinth. Cole swung the truck into the maze of steel, weaving between the rusted walls in a desperate attempt to break line of sight. "They're splitting up," Mara warned from the back. "They'll flush us out." Jackson knew she was right. They couldn't outrun Cade's men, but they could outsmart them. "Everyone out," Jackson ordered. "We split up. They can't follow us all." They abandoned the truck, scattering into the maze of containers. Jackson ran with Ethan, guiding him through the winding paths. His injured ribs protested with each breath, but he ignored the pain. Footsteps echoed close behind them, the sound of boots crunching gravel. Jackson ducked into a narrow gap between two containers, pulling Ethan down beside him. A pair of gunmen passed barely 5 feet away, scanning the area. Jackson held his breath, his hand gripping the pistol tucked into his waistband. The seconds dragged like hours. One of the gunmen paused, turning his head slightly as if he'd heard something. Jackson's finger moved to the trigger. A sharp whistle echoed from the opposite side of the yard. The gunman turned and hurried toward the sound. Jackson exhaled shakily. It was Mara, drawing their attention away. "Come on," Jackson whispered. They moved carefully through the winding paths until they reached the far end of the train yard. The chain-link fence was old and rusted, barely standing in some places. Jackson grabbed a section of the wire and pulled hard, tearing a gap wide enough for them to squeeze through. Mara and Juno met them on the other side minutes later, breathless but unharmed. Cole arrived last, clutching his arm where a bullet had grazed him. "That's the last time I drive," Cole muttered. "I'm retiring." "Retire later," Jackson said. "We need to move." By the time they reached the outskirts of the city, the sun was hanging low in the sky. They stopped near a gas station, exhausted and battered but alive. For a long time, no one spoke. The danger wasn't over. Cade would regroup, send more men, and keep hunting them until he had what he wanted. But for now, they had survived. Ethan sat on the curb, staring at the fading sky. Jackson joined him, lowering himself carefully to the ground. The silence stretched between them until Ethan finally spoke. "You didn't have to save me," Ethan said quietly. "Not after everything." Jackson shook his head. "You're one of us," he said. "That's all that matters." Ethan managed a weak smile, and for the first time in days, Jackson believed that things might just turn out all right. "You know," Ethan said after a pause, "if we ever get a break, I'm taking a week off. No missions, no guns, just a beach and a drink in my hand." "Sounds good," Jackson replied. "You're buying."